All right. How's everyone today? Welcome to my channel. Thanks for tuning in. And this educational channel try to let you know about things that are vital to your life in terms of spiritual, mental, and physical health, but that you don't know about them because they've been suppressed or otherwise restricted from your point of view. You have to dig and dig and dig to get to some of this stuff, and then even when you do, it's out of context and you can't figure out how to put it together with other pieces that you might have. We are doing another Bible Decode, number 311, and we've looked at the Bible from many, many different angles, but particularly from the angle of the Roman origins hypothesis. That is, that the Romans are the true authors of the New Testament. We've looked at many authors who have put out that point of view, such as Joseph Atwill, Michael Menescott, James Valiant, Henry Davis, going back all the way to the 19th century, Bruno Bauer and Sir Ronald Symes, James Valentine Hannay, and we've also looked into Abelard Reuchlin, and now we're looking at some of the work of Roman Piso, who claims that he is a distant, much later ancestor of the Piso family from the first century in Rome, the high-powered aristocratic family who were known as the Little Caesars. And they had kind of a little bit of a civil war going on with the Julian Caesars, the dynasty of Caesars, starting with Julius Caesar and Augustus, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero. And so for that whole period, over a century, there were a number of assassinations that occurred on either side, blamed on the other side. And then this character named Arius Piso is the main person that Roman Piso focuses on. He believes that Arius Piso is the true author of the New Testament, or at least the Gospels, and that the other members of his children and or grandchildren and or other younger relatives were the authors of the rest of it. His basic thesis is that all of the ancient literature, regardless of genre, religion, politics, philosophy, history, math, science, all of it was written by royalty and or their immediate court, and that many of them wrote under various pseudonyms to confuse you as a pleb, that you maybe could write something for yourself, or that there were a wide variety of people writing different books. Which doesn't quite convince me, but I'm still presenting the material, but that explanation rings a little bit hollow. But anyway, I believe the general idea is relatively self-evident, and while I think that there probably could have been exceptions, no doubt that the vast majority of the stuff that was being published at this time was under the auspices, at least in the first century, under the auspices of the Caesars, and that they had full control of censorship, publishing, and distribution within the empire, and that for some semi-literate fishermen and doctors and so on living in Judea, speaking Aramaic, for them to have written a number of um, Gospels in Greek stretches the imagination quite far already. But the actual demonstration of actually who wrote it also is, I'd say, kind of rock solid in terms of the evidence once you kind of know how to look at the evidence. So his idea, his proposal, the second thing is the royal language. So he believes that the royals would use various pseudonyms, pen names, aliases, or whatever, and they would reveal these things to their other fellow royals through this royal language, which kind of employed all of the ancient languages at once, and used various permutations, putting in a different vowel or switching a couple of consonants, A's to, R's to L's or R's to P's, C's to CH's, C's to G's, and vice versa, to kind of cover up the true names of the authors, and but that the royals would be able to kind of suss out who actually was writing these things. And this was kind of a complicated thing, and his research was really about trying to uncomplicate it, trying to put the puzzle together and figure out who is who, where was who, at what specific time, and so on. And both Abelard Royfelin and Rowan Piso undertook this independently in the 1970s and 80s, and they both arrived at the same answer, that the New Testament of, or we'll just say the Gospels, that the Gospels were written by Arius Piso, who was the real person behind the pen name of Josephus. Okay, so Josephus was the author of the Gospels, but it wasn't Josephus, it was really this guy Arius Piso. A number of other authors also contend that Josephus was the true author of the Gospels, but they won't go as far to say that it was actually this guy named Arius Piso. To me, that is a secondary question. By far, the most major importance is that it was that several other authors have posited is that the New Testament was written by Josephus. And the way that you can tell is by reading Josephus and reading it alongside your Gospels, and when you, especially the book of Luke. And when you see the hundreds of passages that are incredibly similar between the two books, and recognize that they were written at the same time, approximately at the same time, then you can start to decode them a little bit. You can see that what they did was that they wrote the Gospels and then they backdated the story by 40 years. The Gospels were written in the 70s and 80s and 90s AD, and the story was backdated to the 30s, early 30s, or late 20s AD. And then many of the prophecies that Jesus makes in the New Testament are literally fulfilled in the pages of Josephus, his 7-volume work called War of the Jews. And one of the main prophecies that is fulfilled is the destruction of Jerusalem, which was, now this war occurred between 66 and 73 AD, and it was fought between the Romans and the Jews, and the two primary Roman generals were Vespasian and his son Titus, who eventually became the new emperors, but at this time they were just the generals. And then in 69 AD, Vespasian got the call to become the new emperor, and he left his son Titus in charge of the siege of Jerusalem. Titus tore Jerusalem limb from limb, or stone from stone, or whatever the language is that is described in the New Testament by Jesus in a prophecy. And Jesus says that this is going to be the sign of his second coming. And so Titus is actually written into the script as the second coming of Jesus. And this was well regarded by the majority of theologians, even up to the 19th century, that they recognized that Titus was the second coming of Jesus, according to War of the Jews. And that, this idea of revelation coming in the future was not. The whole thing had already occurred. But that's just a drop in the bucket as far as the different parallels are concerned. Joseph Atwell looks at the sequence that he calls the Flavian signature. This is a sequence of events, 40 or more separate events that occur between the 3-year ministry of Jesus and the 3-year military campaign of Titus. And it turns out that every place that Titus goes in his military campaign, he goes one place and has a battle, goes another place, has another adventure, goes to another place, has another ordeal that happens, and so on. Every place that Titus goes, Jesus also goes, in the same order, and at each location they encounter a parallel event. Those events are spaced by 40 years, sometimes to the very hour. And so the ministry of Jesus is nothing but a replica of and really a parody of the 3-year military campaign of Titus. But that's still just a drop in the bucket of the evidence, and we're talking that is like 40 separate events. I've gone through all of that in previous videos, but we are going to kind of go over it again when we go word by word over the book of Luke in future videos. But then Michael Menescatz also takes these 250 parallels that he found just in the book of Luke, and he graphed them on a chart with the War of the Jews on the vertical axis and or horizontal axis, and Luke on the vertical axis, and they form 5 almost perfect letters written in Latin: APTVS, or U, possibly US. And so this basically signifies that the Romans not only wrote the New Testament, but they signed their initials to them. Just to mock you even further, because that was the main reason. Not the main reason was to mock the Jews. The main reason was to mellow out the Jews by presenting a Jewish Messiah who was a Prince of Peace and believed in rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's, as opposed to the Messiah that the Jews were waiting for, which was a military commander who was going to help them overthrow the Romans. So the Romans tried to nip that in the bud, and it was a mixed bag. It worked to a certain extent, and it didn't work to a certain extent, just like most psychological operations. Anyway, we're going to look at some of the notes I have of the many, many articles that Roman Piso has written. Here he's talking about the Hasmoneans, which are the Herods. The Hasmoneans were basically the Maccabees, written about in the apocryphal works of 1st and 2nd, 3rd and 4th Maccabees, the first two of which are included into the, I believe, the Catholic Bible as appendices, but not the Protestant Bible. But the Hasmoneans were the dynasty of Jewish kings that ruled, that took over from the Seleucids, Syrian Greeks, around 167 BC up until 63 BC, or maybe a little bit later, and really much later, because Herod was really a Hasmonean as well. Herod the king, the Great, took over in 37 BC, and so you can even include him and the rest of the Herods as really kind of crypto Hasmoneans. But now he's talking about a time period about 60 BC. The Hasmoneans called upon Rome to help retake the temple from these. Well, I'm thinking it's from the Greeks, the Seleucids, Syrians, but I'm not too familiar with that history. So Hasmoneans called upon Rome to help them retake the temple. This was the first actions took place just about the time of Julius Caesar, and he made Herod Antipas II, who's also known as Antipater II, who was the father of Herod, I believe, procurator of Judea. And Antipas then passed that authority down to his son Phasael, which maybe was a brother of Herod, after which Rome installed the other son of Antipas II as king and procurator of Judea, and taught them ethics instead of religion. They also were fighting. Yeah, well, Herod was all full of ethics. You could tell that, right? They also were fighting for basic human rights. So this is kind of Roman Piso's thing, and Abelard Reuchlin too, that these Pharisaic Jews were, they were searching for the abolition of slavery and replacing religion with ethics. I don't know of any other evidence for that, but my approach is basically I'm going to take your work, and I'm going to allow it into my mind. I'm not going to accept it or reject it. I'm just going to take it in, and then I'm going to see if it verifies itself, check into other sources, and marinate it around with the other things that I have that I think that there is evidence for already, and evaluate it over time. So I'm not vouching for exactly what he's saying. I'm just presenting it. They also were fighting for basic human rights for the people of the time, including the abolition of slavery. They were looking for a final solution. Don't know what that means exactly. They took action under Emperor Tiberius. This is the final. So the final solution was the Gospels. That was the final solution for the elites to maintain their system of slavery and their system of domination, just the status quo in general. So that they proposed this Jewish Messiah who was a deferential to Rome and opposed the Jewish traditions by doing things like overturning the tables of the money changers and castigating the Jews who were selling small animals for the sacrifice in outer regions of the temple, and telling his Jewish disciples to abandon their families. These are things that strike at the heart of the Jewish traditions. But when he's discussing Rome, then he says, render unto Caesar's, turn the other cheek, and I've never seen such greater faith than you, centurion, slave-owning Roman, in all of Israel. Or that, slaves obey your masters. And Paul gets into it even further than Jesus does. When you get into the Pauline epistles, even more anti-Jew and even more pro-Roman. So this is what he's talking about with this final solution, to write up this psychological operation about this Jewish Prince of Peace. So it says they took action under Emperor Tiberius. Tiberius, you may know, was the emperor when Jesus was said to have been an adult. Tiberius was the Caesar from 14 AD up until 37 AD. So I would imagine that this was probably late in the reign of Tiberius, and according to Roman Piso, they called in the greatest minds of the Roman Empire to help solve their problem. It was a two-pronged approach. One, create a new religion to replace Judaism, one that included a shopping list of all that the elite wanted. And two, to destroy the Jews and make them believe, that only a little-known sect had survived, a sect that believed in the new religion that they were to create. Now, he seems to buy into some of the stuff that Josephus talks about, even though he knows that Josephus was a fake, regardless of whether Josephus was really himself or whether he's writing under a pen name. Josephus, in his War of the Jews, Josephus claim, according to his autobiography, he was a Jew, and then he defected to the Romans and became a member of the Roman court when he surrendered to General Vespasian. And that is another story that stretches your imagination quite far. But Josephus divides the Jews into really the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the Essenes, and then sometimes he puts in this other group called the Zealots. The Essenes are a very dubious. Many people believe that Jesus was an Essene, but the only mention of the Essene, the only person that ever said that he was a member of the Essenes was Josephus. And the only three people who have ever even mentioned the Essenes are Josephus and Pliny the Elder, another Roman royal, and Philo Judaeus of Alexandria, who was a very close associate of especially the Flavians. His nephew Tiberius Alexander was actually the first person to proclaim Vespasian to be the new emperor. And he was one of the most wealthy people in all of the world, and had a close association with the Roman court, Caesar's palace. So whether the meaning basically that in the operation they were all in on it, and they all made little references to the Essenes to make it seem like they actually existed, but there really isn't any other evidence of them having existed. So he says that the Essenes disbanded in 6 AD, perhaps. The leaders of the Sadducees were now the Herodians, the Herods. All of the descendants of Herod, they all took various roles as leaders, procurators of Judea, or tetrarchs, or other rulers of various parts of Israel. And the Sadducean believers were left in Judea to be slaughtered after 70 AD, once they were no longer of any use to the Herods. The Herods fled back to Rome with the siege of Jerusalem by Vespasian under the direction of Nero, starting in 66 AD. And this was the result of an uprising that was led by several self-proclaimed Jewish messiahs, who, according to the Old Testament prophecies, were there to overthrow the conquering power, in this case the Romans. And so this also gives more, grist to the mill of what the Romans actually did in proposing this Prince of Peace Messiah. Now Roman Piso claims that they tried to do it 30 years earlier, when Tiberius was the emperor, but the plan didn't actually come to fruition until the Flavian dynasty of Caesars took power in the early 70s AD. So the Sadducean believers were left in Judea to be slaughtered once they were no longer of any use to the Herodians. The Pharisees and the scribes, so this is the fourth group that he's talking about, which was really kind of an offshoot of the Pharisees, and it might have been related to some of these Essenes became scribes. Not really sure. I don't even think that Josephus refers to the scribes. But anyway, the Pharisees and scribes were still in this war, and they were the only two Jewish sects existing after 70 CE or 70 AD. Now, one other piece of evidence that strengthens the Roman origins hypothesis is what actually happened to the Pharisees, is that the Pharisees were, through a story very similar to the one that Josephus tells, but this one with Yohanan ben Zakkai, who is one of the leaders of the Pharisees, and he also surrendered to the Roman general, and whether it's Vespasian or Titus, and he also predicted that this new general would become the emperor. And when that did happen, the emperor paid him off by giving him a land grant at Japhne, I believe in Galilee, and to start like a campus, a kind of a university for the study of the Jewish scriptures. And that what becomes rabbinical Judaism. So the Caesars, in this instance, actually did create a religion, and it was in order to mollify the Jews, to get them to interpret the myriad of permutations of the scriptures, of the Jewish scriptures, as opposed to being involved in any type of political activity. And that's exactly what they were trying to do with the more zealot Jews with Christianity. So we can see here that this is exactly what the Romans would do, to create a religion in order to divert the Jews and get them to mellow out. That's exactly what they did with the Pharisees and with their rabbinical Judaism, and that is exactly what they did with the with the Jewish Messiah, which was what was to become Christianity. They did that with the more zealous Jews, the ones that were actually willing to rise up, like a Jewish Messiah. They wanted to replace that violent military Jewish Messiah with a Prince of Peace. So now, but the key point is that these Pharisees, and again, these psychological operations are a mixed bag. It doesn't mean that they're going to work the way that they're designed to work. And in this case, with the Pharisees, what he's saying is that the Pharisees, they fought back through their Talmud, using kind of veiled language. And the key here is that the Pharisees were witnesses of the creation of Christianity. And so they wrote about it in their Talmud in a very mocking way. But they left evidence that the creator of Christianity was Josephus and or Arius Piso. So he says, and the Pharisees not only witnessed what went on, they were finding ways to leave information about it in their texts. They had to make agreements with the Romans to buy, this is the campus at Jaffa, to buy time, to try again at a later time. Jewish leaders were just those who continued the line of descent from Hillel, the Pharisee. Those who were writing the Babylonian Talmud were living in Persia in the 160s AD, and Roman Emperor Lucius Verus was seeking the destruction of the Jews and their Talmud in Celeria in Babylon. Descendants of Hillel the Pharisee, the leadership then being represented by rulers known as the exilarchs. So this is a two-pronged strategy. Now you may know that there are like two versions of the Talmud, the Babylonian and the Jerusalem or Judean Talmud, depending on whether they were exiled or not. Now, Piso would do well if his writings were a little bit more on topic. He ranges around, and so you can blame me for the same thing, that I'm following my notes on this and I'm ending up ranging around on different topics. But his basic idea is that the Romans also then Piso's distant descendants, because this was like the family business. This was all in the family, and he says that all of the early church fathers of the 2nd and 3rd century were also related to Arius Piso